And if the United States no longer wants to lead, Canada will.
The relationship between Canada and the United States has often been described as the most successful bilateral relationship in modern history, the world's longest undefended border, the largest trading partnership, and a shared cultural and historical bond spanning generations. Yet, in a matter of months, this relationship has undergone a seismic shift, with polls showing that Canadian sentiment towards the US reaching a historic low. Today, I want to examine how 14 critical mistakes by the Trump administration have fundamentally altered the Canada-US dynamic, potentially for decades to come. More importantly, I want to share 7 alternative approaches that could have achieved legitimate American policy or even ambitious mega goals without fracturing this crucial alliance. Mistake number 1, misrepresenting the US-Canada trade deficit.
In the case of Canada, it's close to $200 billion a year. And I say, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? I mean, at what point do we say, you got to work for yourselves?
Trump repeatedly claimed a $200 billion trade deficit with Canada, but here are the facts. According to TD Economics, that used US Census Bureau data, the real figure stands at approximately $45 billion US dollars. That 2024 number places Canada as the second smallest deficit, behind only France. And for all that bluster, it is only equivalent of 12.5% of deficit with China and 20% to that of Mexico. So we have a figure that exaggerated the actual imbalance by nearly 450%. This cannot even qualify as a major rounding error, even if we tried. It is a distortion that framed Canada as an exploitative trading partner rather than America's largest export market. The overwhelming driver of this deficit is that the US buys unrefined oil from Canada, which American refineries then process into higher value products. This mischaracterization poisoned negotiations from the start by creating a false premise that Canada was somehow grossly taking advantage of the United States. Mistake number 2, falsely claiming Canada has high tariffs.
We're not going to bend. We've been ripped off as a country for many, many years. We've been subjected to costs that we shouldn't be subjected to. In the case of Canada, we're spending $200 billion a year to subsidize Canada.
Trump erroneously stated that Canada ranks among the highest in the world for tariffs, when in reality, Canada holds one of the lowest positions globally. It ranks 102nd in a list of 137 countries that apply tariffs. According to 2022 World Bank estimates when this data was last published, Canada's average tariff rate was about 1.37% compared to the US rate of 1.49%. This false characterization painted Canada as a protectionist nation when its economy has been progressively opening to global trade for decades now. By misrepresenting Canada's trade policies, Trump created a narrative that tried to justify his aggressive actions against a trading partner whose practices were actually quite similar to America's own. Mistake number 3, incorrectly asserting Canada increased dairy tariffs.
In Canada, we find that they're charging us over 200% for dairy products. You know about that. And when I left, we had that well taken care of, but under Biden, they just kept raising it. Very difficult to deal with.
Trump incorrectly frames the way Canadian dairy tariffs are levied. Let me tell you how it exactly works. Yes, Canada has tariffs above 200% on dairy products imported from the US. That is a fact. However, those high tariffs kick in only after the US has hit a certain quantity of exports of tariff-free dairy sales to Canada each year. And this was negotiated by the previous Trump administration and is now a part of USMCA or CUSMA. The US dairy industry itself acknowledges that they're not even hitting their allowed zero tariff maximum in any category of dairy products. So this big fuss is over a misframed problem. Also, the way the dairy industry in Canada works through its supply management system is an exception and nowhere near the norm. This misinformation created the impression that Canada was somehow actively working against American interests, when the reality was that the dairy tariff system, while certainly protective, has been around and consistent for years now. The dairy sector represents a really small fraction of bilateral trade, yet it became a disproportionate focus of Trump's trade rhetoric, distracting from the overwhelming balanced nature of the broader trading relationship between the two countries. Mistake number 4. Wrongly claiming Canada doesn't import US agricultural products. Despite Canada being the second largest importer of American agricultural goods globally, Trump wrongly stated that Canada doesn't import US agricultural products. This claim ignored the reality that Canadian consumers and businesses rely heavily on American food products, from fresh produce to processed goods. This has damaged trust and created unnecessary tensions in the agricultural sector, where the two countries have deeply integrated supply chains again and mutual dependencies that benefit farmers on both sides of the border. Mistake number 5. Falsely stating US banks are prohibited in Canada.
Banks are not, as an example, allowed. Did you know that? That banks, American banks, are not allowed to do business in Canada. Can you believe that?
Trump falsely claimed that US banks are prohibited from operating in Canada when major US institutions like JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, and Bank of America maintain a significant Canadian operation. If nothing else, this at least tries to imply that Canada unfairly restricts American financial services, when in reality, the Canadian banking sector is open to US participation. This claim was particularly damaging because it portrayed Canada as having closed markets in a sophisticated sector where both countries actually maintain relatively open access, undermining the foundation of financial cooperation that has benefited both economies. Mistake number 6. Referring to Canada as America's 51st state.
And to be honest with you, Canada only works as a state. It doesn't. We don't need anything they have. As a state, it would be one of the great states anyway. This would be the most incredible country visually. If you look at a map, they drew an artificial line right through it between Canada and the US. Just a straight artificial line. Somebody did it a long time ago, many, many decades ago, and makes no sense. It's so perfect as a great and cherished state.
This one hurt a lot. The most inflammatory statement came when Trump referred to Canada as America's 51st state, a comment that was initially looked upon as a joke. Trump first talked about it when Justin Trudeau visited Mar-a-Lago to meet Trump after he got elected as the 47th President of the United States. Perhaps Canadians were naive, and it is well known that Canadians can take a joke, even if it is at their own expense. But then Trump said it again, and again, and again. Soon it became clear that he was no longer joking, and this ignited widespread outrage across Canada's social and political spectrum. For a country that has proudly created its own identity for decades, this statement was particularly provocative. It demonstrated a profound misunderstanding of Canadian national identity and sovereignty, uniting Canadians across political lines in their defense of their independence and distinct national character. Mistake number 7. Threatening Canada's sovereignty.
What I said to the secretary is Canada's sovereignty is not up to debate. Period.
And Julie says some of the other G7 leaders weren't aware of how serious the threats are.
The reaction of my colleagues coming from Europe was really about this absurd threat of annexation. Was really is that a joke?
Following up on the 51st state comment, through his various statements and policy actions, especially calling Prime Minister Justin Trudeau as Governor Trudeau repeatedly, Trump effectively threatened Canada's sovereignty, leading to unprecedented anger among Canadians towards the US. By suggesting that Canada should somehow align its policies with American interests, regardless of its own national priorities, Trump violated the fundamental principle of respect for sovereignty that has guided the relationship for generations. Not surprisingly at all, this approach created a defensive posture in Canadian politics where leaders across the spectrum felt compelled to demonstrate their commitment to protecting Canada's independence rather than seeking cooperative and constructive solutions.
Look, I called him Governor Trudeau because they should be the 51st state, really. It would make a great state, and the people of Canada like it. they'd pay lower taxes. They have virtually no military. They have a very small military. They pay less than 1%.
Mistake number 8, making unfounded security claims about China and Russia in Canada. Trump made the unfounded claim that Canada is constantly surrounded by ships from China and Russia, a bizarre assertion that both misrepresents Canada's maritime security situation and implies that the country cannot manage its own borders. This statement not only lacked factual basis, but suggested that Canada's security interests and posture were markedly different from that of the United States. This actually undermines Canada's status as a capable security partner whose own robust defense capabilities and intelligence services that work so closely with American counterparts to ensure continental security doesn't matter. Sure, the US is the one with significantly larger military capabilities, but that is also why security alliances exist. It is never a one-way street. What is most bizarre about this assertion is that the US and Canada maintain one of the most open security and intelligence sharing doctrines anywhere in the world. So how can it be in Canada's interest to even allow something like this? It just does not make sense. Mistake number 9, imposing blanket tariffs threatening Canadian jobs.
United Steelworkers Union says more than 470 people work at Ivaco Rolling Mills. It's one of North America's largest producers of hot-rolled wire rod and continuous cast steel billets. It was originally established in the early 1970s, and it is the community's single largest employer. Now, the company says the layoffs are due to tariffs, the uncertainty they bring, and declining orders.
By imposing across-the-board 25% tariffs that threatened up to 278,000 Canadian jobs, Trump has now united Canadians in their determination to diversify trade away from the US. The Chamber of Commerce of Canada noted that these tariffs created the strongest consensus for economic diversification in Canadian history. Rather than creating leverage, this move is now galvanizing Canadian businesses and policymakers to reduce their dependence on the American market, accelerating efforts to develop alternative trading relationships that will have long-term implications for the North American economic integration agenda. Mistake number 10, undermining decades of integrated trade relationships. Trump's approach undermined decades of integrated trade, forcing Canada to fundamentally reimagine its economy. The North American economy has evolved over generations to create deeply interconnected supply chains that benefit businesses and consumers on both sides of the border. By disrupting these established patterns, Trump created unnecessary inefficiencies and costs that harm economic growth in both countries. This approach ignored the reality that the integration of the Canadian and American economies has been a source of competitive advantage for North America in the global marketplace. Just ask the auto workers in Detroit, Michigan or Windsor, Ontario, who would literally see auto parts go back and forth 6 to 8 times before being assembled into a final SUV or a truck. Mistake number 11, ignoring interdependencies between economies. Trump fundamentally underestimated the deep interdependencies between the US and Canadian economies. Canada supplies essential goods not easily substituted by American producers. From oil, electricity, critical minerals, and automotive components, the list goes on. Similarly, Canadian consumers rely on American imports since domestic production is incapable of meeting demand across many sectors. This interdependence means that tariffs on Canadian goods ultimately harm American consumers and businesses as well, creating a lose-lose scenario rather than a win-lose scenario framework that Trump envisioned. Mistake number 12, failing to anticipate the Buy Canadian backlash.
The Buy Canadian movement has become a huge force in the last week alone, changing how and where people shop. Grocery store owners like Marilyn Dibb are astounded by just how quickly Canadians have dumped American products in the wake of President Donald Trump's tariff threats. And at the Canada-US border, officials are reporting a huge drop in southbound traffic at some ports of entry.
Perhaps the most unexpected Canadian response was the backlash these policies would generate. The Buy Canadian movement has gained unprecedented momentum, with retailers reporting 50 to 30% sales increases for products with prominent Product of Canada or Made in Canada labeling. Cross-border tourism has plummeted to pandemic-level lows, according to recent CBP data, representing billions in lost revenue for American businesses. This consumer-level response demonstrates how trade tensions can spill over into broader economic and cultural relationships, creating lasting changes in behavior that will be really difficult to reverse. Mistake number 13. Misrepresenting Canadian political dynamics. Trump misrepresented Canadian political dynamics by suggesting Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was leveraging tariff disputes for re-election, despite the fact that Trudeau had already announced that he wouldn't be running in the next election. On the surface, this demonstrated a concerning lack of basic understanding of Canadian political reality and suggested that perhaps Trump was not receiving accurate briefings about the political context in which his trade policies were operating. But I think that Trump is smarter than that, way smarter, and he absolutely knew what he was doing. He was sowing seeds of doubt, hoping that some of those seeds would germinate, but this was one of his weakest attempts at that, and he didn't even try that hard, which was kind of funny actually. Mistake number 14. Disregarding a historical alliance. Finally, Trump disregarded the historical alliance between the US and Canada, including their joint efforts in major areas, all the way from military conflicts, drug development, humanitarian crisis, to climate and weather modeling, oceanic research, intelligence sharing, and space exploration. This historical amnesia ignored decades of mutual sacrifice and cooperation that has built amazing and incredible goodwill between the nations, from fighting together in world wars to collaborating on the International Space Station. The US-Canada relationship has been characterized by shared values and mutual support. By treating Canada as just another trading competitor rather than a trusted ally, Trump unfortunately squandered away diplomatic capital accumulated through generations of cooperation. Okay, finding fault and identifying mistakes is the easy part. Here are 7 ways in which Trump could have constructively aligned his MAGA agenda in a way that did not destroy decades of goodwill and threatened a relationship that is, I think, incredibly valuable in a fractured, multipolar world. Not to mention that all of this happened in a matter of weeks. It's quite remarkable. Alternative strategy number 1. Pursue sector-specific negotiations rather than blanket tariffs.
As for the tariffs, the president made his position on this quite clear with the statement that he put out. And it was a retaliatory statement due to the escalation of rhetoric that we've seen out of Ontario, Canada.
Instead of imposing across-the-board 25% tariffs that threatened 278,000 Canadian jobs without retaliation from Canada and 510,000 jobs with, Trump could have pursued targeted sector-specific agreements. This approach would have allowed for addressing specific trade concerns without disrupting the entire economic relationship or even triggering provincial power plays like Ontario's 25% export tax on electricity, affecting over 1 million US households.
It's hurting the American economy, it's hurting the Canadian economy. Uncertainty is what people don't like hearing in general life, not to mention the markets are tumbling, and investors from around the world are looking twice at America and Canada to invest.
By focusing on particular sectors where legitimate concerns existed, let's say dairy or softwood lumber, Trump could have achieved meaningful policy changes without the collateral damage that has now been caused to the broader economic relationship. Alternate strategy number 2, leverage subnational relationships. What is somehow not discussed enough and more substantially in mainstream US-Canada economics are the cross-border relationships at the state and provincial levels. These actually serve as important counterbalances. Trump could have worked through these established channels between US states and Canadian provinces that have deeply integrated economic ecosystems, particularly in areas like electricity, water management, and environmental protection. These regional economic ecosystems could have served as foundations for building broader bilateral cooperation. Get some shared wins, make people happy, move your agenda forward. It's a reasonably good strategy, to be honest. Alternate strategy number 3. Emphasize shared continental challenges. Rather than framing Canada as an adversary, Trump could have positioned both countries to face external challenges together. shared agendas, whether economic competition from China, cybersecurity challenges, or moving manufacturing closer to home, could have led to or even forced renewed cooperation despite political differences. A continental competitiveness enhancing approach would have recognized that Canada and the US succeed together or fail together in the global economy. This framing could have created space for addressing legitimate trade concerns while still allowing and maintaining the broader alliance. Alternate strategy number 4. Engage diplomatically before making public statements.
Why are we supporting a country 200 billion plus a year? Our military is at their disposal. All of these other things, they should be a state. Well, absolutely, but we had a very good conversation. Mark called me today at 10 o'clock. We put out a statement. We had a very, very good talk. He's going through an election now, and we'll see what happens, but
when Trump finally had an excellent discussion with the Prime Minister on 28 March 2025, the tone softened on both sides almost instantly. Starting with diplomatic engagement rather than aggressive tweets would have preserved goodwill while still allowing for tough negotiations behind closed doors. Canadians, like citizens of any other nation, respond poorly to perceived threats to their own sovereignty. By acknowledging Canada's status as an independent nation with legitimate interests of its own, Trump could have actually created space for productive dialogue and negotiations. Public ultimatums forced Canadian leaders, whether Pierre Poilievre or Mark Carney, into defensive positions where compromise became politically difficult and untenable. Effective diplomacy requires giving counterparts room to make concessions without appearing to give away too much ground or capitulating to foreign pressure. Trump's public approach made it politically impossible for Canadian leaders to make concessions without appearing to surrender to Trump's will and surrender the country's sovereignty. Alternate strategy number 5. Recognize mutual interdependence. Trump could have acknowledged the reality that Canada and the US maintain unavoidable interdependencies. Canada exports essential goods not easily substituted by American producers: oil, electricity, potash, critical minerals, and automotive components. By recognizing this relationship, Trump could have framed trade negotiations as adjustments to a fundamentally sound relationship rather than a wholesale renegotiation of a really bad deal. Alternate strategy number 6. Focus on making North America competitive globally. Instead of treating Canada as a competitor, Trump could have pursued a Fortress North America strategy, wherein allies reduce trade barriers amongst themselves while presenting a united front against global competitors. This approach would have recognized that the real economic challenge comes not from Canada, but from competitors that operate under fundamentally different economic systems. By strengthening North American economic integration, both countries would have actually better positioned themselves to compete globally. This strategy would have also aligned with Trump's broader concerns about Chinese economic practices while preserving the crucial Canada-US economic relationship. Alternate strategy number 7. Use accurate data and facts in negotiation. This is a no-brainer. Perhaps most fundamentally, Trump could have based his approach on accurate information about the Canada-US relationship by correctly stating the actual trade deficit, acknowledging Canada's relatively low tariff rates, recognizing its substantial imports of US agricultural products, and accurately representing its historical contributions. Trump could have built credibility and trust. Negotiations based on shared facts are inherently more productive than those that begin from disputed premises. This approach would have allowed both sides to focus on real issues rather than wasting diplomatic energy correcting misrepresentations. Unfortunately, here we are. By the way, Trump and the American people have every right to do what is right for them. It is their country, and they should do whatever the Democratic majority decides. If damaging and weakening their most trusted friend and ally is a part of that equation, then that's that. But actions have consequences.
The old relationship we had with the United States, based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperation, is over.
The mistakes Trump made in his approach to Canada have awakened a new wave of economic nationalism north of the border that will have lasting outcomes for both nations. The Buy Canadian movement, provincial power plays, and accelerated trade diversification efforts represent not just temporary reactions but potentially permanent shifts in Canadian economic strategy. Yet, the fundamental interdependence between our economies remains. The most likely outcome is not a complete decoupling, but rather the establishment of a new equilibrium, one characterized by more deliberate cooperation rather than assumed integration. This relationship will feature greater economic independence on both sides, targeted rather than comprehensive cooperative agreements, and explicit rather than implicit mutual benefit calculations. For American policymakers, the lesson is clear. Canada is not the 51st state, but a sovereign nation with its own interests and leverage points.
Let me be clear. We will never be the 51st state. We will bear any burden and pay any price to protect the sovereignty and independence of our country.
Effective engagement requires accurate information, respect for sovereignty, and recognition of mutual interdependence. The alternative, as we're seeing now, is a fractured relationship that ultimately harms both countries. Canada by no means is a perfect nation. Neither are Canadians perfect people. In the last few years, we have lost a sense of national identity, decreasing standard of living, increased grocery expenses, unaffordable housing, long wait times at hospitals, uncontrolled immigration, public sector bloat, tax inertia. These are all symptomatic of a country that needs a health check and an intervention. Yes, the Canadian dream feels broken at times, but that does not take away from the fact that Canadians still believe in the goodness of the human spirit. Canadians still want to be good people. This is not me romanticizing a country, but a reflection of my own experience as I walk the streets of this country and talk to people, many of whom don't really care beyond wanting to create a peaceful life for themselves, their families, and their communities. That Canada still exists, and beyond the noise and the rhetoric, it will continue to be that way if the majority aspire for that.
And our response to these latest tariffs is to fight, is to protect, and to build. We will fight the US tariffs.
So for Canadians, this fiasco may ultimately accelerate the country's evolution into a more diverse, resilient, and innovative economy better positioned for the uncertainties of the 21st century. The tariff challenge, while unwelcome, could be the catalyst for long overdue economic diversification and innovation.
The road ahead will be long. There is no silver bullet. There is no quick fix. And I know and I understand that many are feeling anxious and worried about the future. Fundamental change is always unsettling.
As Canada navigates this challenging transition, success will depend not just on government policy but on the ability of the businesses and citizens on both sides of the border. By acknowledging past mistakes and charting a more constructive path forward, Canadians can hope to rebuild at least some parts of what has been, at its best, the most successful bilateral relationship in modern history. But the scars will probably remain for a long time and may not even heal completely. If you found this useful, like this video, hit that subscribe button, share it with someone who you think will find it helpful as well. Let me know how you are navigating uncertainty in the Trump era. I'll see you on the next one and have a great day.